Yeah, but their thing, no, their thing is that it's owned by China, and they're worried that the Chinese companies are obligated to report to the Chinese government. So they're scared that the data that they're gathering from their TikTok users is going to be given to the Chinese authorities. That's the only reason. Yeah, I mean, you could not say the word Jesus in a song back in the day. Now you're driving Rolls fucking Rolls and the swing vehicle is
You see? You see? You see? That's what I'm saying. See? Yeah.
hello, bro.
Hi,
How are you? Good to see you.
okay.
Are you well? Please take a seat. How are you keeping?
I'm keeping well, and you?
The struggle continues. So this has become a made-for-TV event.
It's a made for TV. Yes, made for live stream. So definitely. When you get my speakers, what we do is just what Mark said.
Yeah.
My check, and I think once you're good, once you're ready,
Okay.
you can comment.
So my broadcast feed, which camera is the main one? That one? Or is this one going to be that dead? That one. So that's what people are watching from home with. Okay. All right.
So everyone, for the side of the chair, you can use that. So really switched on.
Okay.
Just do a quick test.
Testing, 1, 2, 3.
Test, test. Test, test.
Pronounced D, then that's Sesotho. So in Setswana, it will be written D. So if it's Dineo, the Tswana starts with D. Ditebo, Sotho starts with
Good morning, everyone. How are you? Are you okay? Great. Okay.
Just last week, I was walking down the street. I observed this lovely lady that I wanted to meet. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and everybody across the world, whoever is watching, tuned in to this live stream. We have a few people here in the audience here, but by and large, we're talking to you from Radio Park in Johannesburg in South Africa, and it's an important month for South Africa and South Africans in general. It's Human Rights Month, and it's during this month that we remember that which happened in South Africa at Sharpeville, where a number of South Africans were killed by the police. And that day has been remembered, particularly at this time of the year, to think about human rights in general and what sacrifices people made in the attainment of democracy, and to end the suffering that apartheid had brought upon South Africans. So it's an important time for the country, an important time for South Africans. But as we think further, 1994, a lot of us who were alive, and some of us have got grey hair, will remember queuing up for hours to cast our first votes at the time. There was promise of a future, promise of what the end of apartheid might mean, because we then felt and believed that human rights were becoming a given, and that we would experience them, and never would we ever question whether our human rights would be abused or afforded to us. Life has happened since then, time has passed, and the circumstances of 1994 are not the circumstances of 2024. We also now have modern rights. As technology has come to the fore, as the world has changed, as we've digitized, we've got new rights. And some of the challenges that we face are, we know what we wanted, but we don't know that which is owed to us still, and we're also not always aware of the rights that belong to us. So we're going to be exploring the theme of human rights. It's being celebrated this year, this month in particular, under the theme 3 Decades of Respect for and the Promotion of Human Rights. I've got a distinguished panel that are going to help me unpack the theme, but also really from their perspectives, because they work in different areas of endeavor and expertise, and they're going to share with us their thoughts in their areas, but also generally on the human rights issue. If you're watching from home, I'd like to invite you to comment in the link below, and we'll track your thoughts, your comments, because we want you to be very much a part of this conversation. And we'll pose these questions to our panelists. It may be there are issues that you are faced with every single day that we are not going to bring up, but we'd love to hear from you and put them out there so that we're all aware. With that, then, it's my great pleasure to welcome our distinguished panel who are going to help us unpack this theme as we come towards the end of Human Rights Month in South Africa. A very warm welcome to you, Professor David Luka Musoma, the chairperson of the Commission for the Promotion and Protection of the Rights of Cultural, Religions and Linguistic Communities. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to you.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Grafni Seleka, who is the State Law Advisor at the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. Welcome to you.
Thank you very much for being here.
All right, and I've saved the best till last. Dr. Ditlare Rabele, who's the Gender Program Manager at the Foundation for Human Rights. Thank you, all of you, for joining us. I'm going to start with you, Ditlare. Maybe just to give us an overall view. When we talk about human rights Month, and where we are in South Africa in 2024, what are the big flags for you in terms of what we should be cognizant of in the modern age? I think 1994, we wanted to vote. We wanted better housing. We wanted health. We wanted education. There were so many things that we wanted then. Some of them, sadly, still on the radar. But from your world and your perspective, in 2024, what are the big issues that we really should be mindful of as we discuss the issue of human rights?
Thanks, Peter, and thanks for inviting us, and greetings to the viewers. So 30 years later, one would say, yes, progress has been made in ensuring that people have their rights respected, and one of the key issues that one can speak to at this moment is access to information and the freedom of speech, freedom of assembly. It's very, very important that we acknowledge that, and that includes the role of media, journalists, and that's very, very important to ensure that citizens are informed. And now moving on to other issues, as you mentioned, education, health, housing, progress has been made, but the question of quality, that's a totally different question in terms of would we say we are happy with the quality of such services as part of our human rights. Now, moving on, looking at access to information, the greatest challenge that we have now is social media and disinformation. Now, how much of that impacts on our rights to access information? How do we then distill what is really useful information and not propaganda? These are some of the challenges that, particularly as we move towards the elections in about 2 months' time, it's very, very important, the role of social media and information technology in giving information and disinformation, which then impacts on our voting rights and voting patterns as a country, as a citizenry. The second one would be, for me, gender-based violence. It's close to my heart because I work in that space. South Africa ranks very high in the world in terms of high levels of gender-based violence, and the challenge is, how do we address this? How do we change the mindsets of perpetrators? Is government doing enough? Are there enough resources for this? What about the legislations? We have progressive legislation as a country, but the implementation is a problem. But most importantly, are the people, the citizens, aware of their rights? Do people know where they can report gender-based violence? What is it being done to rehabilitate perpetrators? What are we doing in schools to raise awareness on gender-based violence? So I think these are some of the key issues that come to my mind. Lastly, the rights of women in terms of economic empowerment. South Africa is not doing well in terms of addressing the inequality, and we are failing because our constitution is based also on international protocols. The Sustainable Development Goals 30, we are 6 years to get into 2030. But the gap is widening between the rich and the poor, particularly looking at the feminine phase of poverty and looking at the manner in which women don't have access to credit. So women are generally excluded from the economy. And how do they then fight other challenges such as gender-based violence? Because research has shown that most of the victims who are women, they stay in abusive relationships because they are dependent on their spouses or partners who become perpetrators. So we need to really be intentional about economic empowerment of women as a country, and including gender budgeting in all aspects, financial literacy. Women need to have equal opportunities to have access to funding for their businesses from all the financial institutions, which remains a key problem. So I'll stop at that.
All right, you've mentioned quite a number of things, and we'll unpack all of those point by point. And I think a lot of these will overlap. You talked about the law. I'm going to harass Grafni during the course of this conversation. But Prof, I want to start with you as well, because your area, cultural, religious, and linguistic rights, is broad and covers a lot of areas that are very close to our hearts, that people are passionate about and want to protect. Your thoughts and reflections as you wear that hat about human rights in 2024.
Thank you so much, Peter, for the opportunity really to share with South Africans about the work of the CRL Rights Commission as part of Chapter 9 institutions in the Constitution. My reflection as a chair of that commission is one really that focuses on the neglect of the rights of communities. Because our reflection of the human rights really places the rights of communities on a lower radar. Why is that so? It is so because we ignored the genius of the South African lawmakers who saw it necessary that of all the rights that need to be protected in the Constitution, important among those would be the rights of communities. When communities are oppressed, they're not oppressed as a group, as an individual. They are oppressed as a group. When they are removed from their land, their ancestral land, they are removed as a group. When you look at that, it is that which must be protected. Now, the role of the Commission is one of what we call cultural, religious, and linguistic literacy. How best to educate our people to understand their rights as communities. And this is a key element in our educational model throughout the country. Why is this the case? Because we start with the concept of Ubuntu. What does it mean to be human? Our humanity is inextricably connected together. It is when we lose that we lose our humanity and as communities. We protect the rights of communities in terms of ensuring that we develop peace, friendship, humanity, tolerance, equality among and within the religious organizations. We also assist communities to develop their own diminished heritages. There are many heritages in terms of language, in terms of culture, in terms of religion, that have disappeared. So we assist them to resuscitate. We also ensure that there be respect among cultural, religious, and linguistic communities in the country. Because when we do that, we'll be able to build a united South Africa, bound by a common loyalty to South Africa and its people. So those are the key elements. So I'll be able to indicate the areas of focus as we go forward. But I want to also indicate lack of what I call jurisprudence on the role of culture in the development of law in our country.
All right. Fascinating. And that very conveniently leads us to you, Grafni. The law, I'm not sure that it can be failed, really, because a lot of people around the world envy our Constitution. We've got a really brilliant document, Bill of Rights, that is exemplary. And part of the fortune of obtaining democracy late was that we could learn from many people around the world. Why do you think then that whilst we have this amazing document in hand, that the lived experience isn't that we enjoy all that is in the Constitution.
Thank you, Mr. Ndoro. As the department, and also because what I can say about the Constitution, I can say it has laid the level ground. It has leveled the playing ground in terms of within which individuals and the state can be able to access those rights. Access of those rights in terms of the enforcement that have been put in place, the mechanisms that are there for the individuals, the communities, and all role players that they can use to enforce those rights. I mean in terms of the Chapter 9 institutions, like Professor Musoma has mentioned them, that are there, that have been put in place, that are there to support the government, are there to support the constitutional democracy. And then, in fact, what is really required going forward is then to ensure that there is an awareness on those rights. How can they be used? Then we have seen some court judgment that came out through the human rights, through the use of the human rights as the focus in terms of enforcing them. As the department, my panelist has mentioned the GBV. The department has implemented the three legislations that ensure that the victims of GBV and femicide are protected. The accused, in terms of those who committed the GBV, are really brought to book. This is in the form of Domestic Violence Act, the Criminal Procedure Act, and all legislation that have been really enforced to ensure that the protection of vulnerable groups, the women and children, are really protected. The department also is supporting the LGBTIQ communities. There is a program in the department that is there to implement and to promote those rights. And to ensure that really it is that program is put on a higher level, the minister, the deputy minister is the co-chair, and member of the suicide, they both chair that forum. This is a sign that human rights are there, but they are not there on paper. It's up to individuals and the community to ensure that they are used. And then government, in terms of the constitutions, has to enforce those rights and ensure that those rights are promoted. Promoted in the form of maybe awareness, and hence I mentioned the task team that is in place in terms of the GBV, the task team that is in place in terms of the LGBTI communities, and if also what you call NAP. NAP is the National Action Plan against racism, unfair discrimination, and related intolerance. These are the programs that are really in there to enforce those rights that are in the Constitution. As the department, really, we are ensuring that the rights in the form of those programs and past legislations are really protected and are really enforced to ensure that there is an access of those rights and there's an access of those forums that are in place. There might not be enough in terms of the communities out there accessing those rights or leveling the playing field wide enough for them to be used. But in terms of really access to, for instance, from my background and from my domain, is access to courts, which really has been expanded to ensure that even at the communities that are access to courts, like we've got the small claims court, we've got the equality courts that can be used. And those courts were never there. And even the jurisdiction of those courts have been expanded for them to avoid the backlog that has been the complaint at the higher cost, to say there are so many cases that are not really finalized speedily.
All right. We're going to stick with the law for a bit. because the prof did raise an issue, and he says that there's not enough jurisprudence, if I remember correctly. Do you want to put that question directly to him in the sense of what you would like to see more of, and where the law is coming short in your view? And maybe we can get a response from Grafney.
First, my fellow panelists, is that we live in a country with a history of oppression, whose culture and language were undermined, whose system of laws in terms of the cultural communities were not brought to the fore. Now, I have not seen how scholars, legal people, theorize about the concept of Ubuntu and its place in the legal system, how it guides the way we do law. Because my definition of Ubuntu as an overarching ethical principle upon which all these elements, when you talk justice, is defined under the rubric of Ubuntu. But we talk justice as if it's something alien because we are not connecting it to the language of the people. It becomes foreign. The language we use is foreign. And yet we have a rich cultural history which can become the bedrock of our legal system.
Fascinating, and I wonder what your thoughts are, because as he was speaking, I was busy thinking, yes, Ubuntu, something that I understand and conceptualize as a black person. What if I'm Indian? What if I'm colored? What if I'm white? How does the law with an Ubuntu face help me? This must be one of your challenges.
It's a main challenge indeed, just to go straight to it in terms of the languages in court. I think there is one judge in the Pretoria High Court about a matter that I can't recall the specific case, where I think it was both the defense and the opposition parties were both whites, and they couldn't, and the issue pertained to a black issue, so to say, and they're complaining then why there is no a lawyer. There is not an African lawyer or a black lawyer or an African woman lawyer in that particular case. Ubuntu, if Prof can remember the Makwanyani case, that really abolished death penalty because it's a crime against humanity. The Ubuntu values were mentioned in that particular case. Hence, death penalty was abolished because of the Ubuntu principles, the humanity. And then Ubuntu also can be called as well. We were discussing offline about the chieftaincy case that was decided by the Constitutional Court some 4 or 5 years ago in the kinship in Venda, where the Constitutional Court proclaimed that an heir, and normally the culture is normally a male heir should be the successor. But that Constitutional Court case confirmed that a female heir in that instance was confirmed as the leader of that particular tribe in Venda. Those are the issues of the values that the Constitutional Court confirmed. And also there's a particular section in the Constitution that really emphasizes when a court determines a matter, customary law has to be taken into cognizance when a judgment is pronounced on a particular issue. The department, as you can see, maybe like, for instance, there was an issue that was discussed in the previous conference about if in a case both parties are from African background, then why not language that is understood between the two parties not used instead of using English? And then currently now the language of court is English, but depends on the incumbent now, the current now Deputy Chief Justice gave a judgment not years ago in Xhosa language. Full judgment by the Supreme Court of Appeal in Xhosa language, meaning there is no. It's about maybe emphasizing that when to the Legal Practice Council that regulates the lawyers in the country, and also to the Judicial Service Commission in terms of for the presiding officer from the judges, to ensure that if circumstances allow, then the language can be used, any other language that is really conversant to applicable to all the parties, so that there is no sort of disadvantage to either of the parties in terms of particular language. But if really it's applicable to both, that language commonly known to both can be used. Then Ubuntu principles are there. It might not really been enough. Let me give you an example of the equality courts, which has really been established under the Equality Act. The intention of though it's an ideal, the intention of the legislation when they establish the equality courts is like if you have been unfairly treated or been harassed or been spoken to in a language that really doesn't go with the human rights, then you can approach the equality courts, and within that equality courts, the intention is just to avoid the atmosphere, the normal environment of the courts, so that the presiding officer can sit in a round table like this, not in a formal court settings, where parties can discuss whatever that was that has been infringed in a fair, transparent, and open environment, so that the presiding officer can not be seen as somebody up there and the parties are down there, and that there is that inquisitorial atmosphere, and then that thing can be discussed in an informal way without really putting in more court processes in that particular.
One gets a sense that the intentions are good, and that the laws are getting written with good intentions. But I have no doubt, and I turn to you, Ditlare, where whilst the laws might be there, somehow they are not always helping women, particularly with gender-based violence. And I just wonder if you could maybe highlight some of the areas where women's rights are coming short, even though the legislation is there to help them.
Thanks, Peter. So the key challenge is awareness. Many of the women and children and the elderly and youth, particularly those in rural communities, they are not aware of the services. So if we talk about equality courts, how many are there, for instance, in the province of Limpopo? How many are they in Guyana? How far are they from the communities? So the services that could be there, the challenge is, are they easily accessible? Are the communities aware? Are these institutions well-resourced? One of the other key issues is how the police is limited in terms of supporting the victims of gender-based violence. In many cases, when they go to report, it's either there's no friendly room for a victim to come in and speak. There's no psychosocial support. But other issues have to deal with those women who have disabilities. Do we have personnel in the SAPS, for instance, which will be the first point, who understand or can have a conversation using sign language if a woman who is hard of hearing comes to report? And then the prosecution itself, do we have capacity in those institutions? And the time it takes to have access to justice for victims, it's really problematic. Firstly, it has to do with the health department. There's the J88 form that has to be completed or filled. That has been a problem for many victims because, one, they have to travel long distance to the health sectors, to the health facilities. Secondly, the evidence gets tampered with along the way. If we think of someone who has been sexually violated and they have to spend a couple of days not taking a bath so they can preserve the evidence, and the closest hospital is like 50 kilometers away. I mean, by the time they get to the clinic, somehow the evidence would have been tampered. And the worst part is the commitment of the health officials in some of these health facilities who do not fill in that form correctly. And that means there's no prosecution that would be successful. So these are some of the issues that really affect the rights of women and children, and particularly those in rural communities. So it is important to make people aware of the services that are available. And also I want to speak on what Prof has mentioned, the issue of language. Can we have these documents in local languages, in simple form? The legal terms are so abstract. Sitting here myself, not coming from the legal background, I find it so abstract for people to really understand, what are we talking about here? Now, what more of someone who's sitting in Kwakwa in the rural Free State to make sense of this and how this impact on their rights? So the legislation is good on paper, but I think we need simpler versions. We need to use local languages much, much more. Thanks.
Okay, all right. So we're gonna. You wanna pose?
I want to say this, that there are many people who say of documents, they are good documents. How do you assess the goodness of a document? Or anything. It could be a constitution. The goodness, effective of the document is tested in its application, in the changes that it brings about in the lives of the people. All of these things, people tell you, this thing is great, this thing is great. Until it is tested, you cannot make a claim of its goodness. Thank you.
Okay. As we close off the focus on the law, we're going to probably touch on it throughout our conversation. But access to justice is a really big one. And a lot of people can't afford a lawyer. And it seems that if you've got lots of money, chances are you're going to have a good time going through the court system. But if you have nothing, you get a public defender, and as well-meaning as this person is, if you go into their office, they have files like this. They don't have time to give attention to the minutiae that's required to defend that client. How do we ensure that we don't have another 30 years where people, just because they can't afford the law, don't get the justice they deserve?
Earlier I mentioned the small claims court. I also mentioned the equality courts. Those are courts that have been put in place to ensure that each and every individual can access to them without the use of a lawyer. But I know every time when you have a matter that really needs court intervention, we really shivers because you'll need a lawyer. The intention of the establishment of those courts, especially the equality courts, is because more especially when we do awareness, we focus on those courts. We don't really focus more on the high courts because of the fees, the high fees that are normally determine the whole thing. Then we are partnering with the Human Rights Commission, the Commission for Gender Equality, and the legal aid. The legal aid is there to provide free legal services to members of the community. And then of lately, they're also handling equality court matters, provided the other side is not represented by the legal aid. We are also have a discussion with the lawyers for human rights, because previously they were not involved, but we are partnering with them in terms of retaking some of the cases for the individuals to those courts. I'm more focus on the small, the lower courts, the magistrate court. And I'll be focusing more on access to justice, in particular the equality courts. Because the intention of the legislation might not really been realized as yet, but we are making roadshows in terms of making them people aware of the usage of the equality courts and how important how important they are in terms of really realizing their human rights. The grounds for usage of the equality courts is unfair discrimination, harassment, and hate speech. Those are the elements that really we come from in terms of those apartheid years where we have been really harassed in terms of for instance, sexual orientation, in terms of race, in terms of nationality as well. And then, if really you have been really subject to those unfair discrimination issues, then you are at liberty to approach the equality courts, and then we are partnering with those institutions to ensure that there is a massive access of those courts, because alone alone as the department won't be able to cater for each and everyone because of the elements of the fees and element of the budgetary constraint the government is always really facing. But we are making some strides in terms of involving other stakeholders to ensure that members of the public have an access to those courts, particularly the lower courts, in terms of accessing or enforcing their rights.
Okay. I mean, I get a sense that you just need more budget, actually. More courts, more lawyers, more public defenders, because the population is growing much faster than the resources can allow. I want us to look a little bit at the role of a public broadcaster. I'm passionate about public broadcasting because I think that our job and our role is critically important in moving a society forward. SABC, we talk about informing, educating, and entertaining. And I just wonder, as you wear your CRL hat again, the role the public broadcaster can do in helping the social cohesion project, the understanding of different cultures project, and also protecting, I guess, language could be another area.
I think first I need to give credit to the role that the public broadcaster has played with regard to the support we have received from this body for the CRL. For the last 5 years, we have had what we call investigative hearings throughout the country, and we have had the support, the accompaniment of the broadcaster. With that, we've been able to reach cross-sectional number of people, making them aware, understand what CRL is all about, the role of culture, the role of religion, the role of language in creating a new society, different from where we come from. And I realized that, for example, we have had commercialization of religion and abuse of the people's belief system. When we began, people were saying, don't use this, are you attacking religious institution? And we said, no, we want to use this medium in order to make people aware of challenges they might encounter. When you are aware, you are better alert. So the outcome of that investigation and exposure has made many people aware and reduced the incidences of abuse, for instance. Eating of grass, people walked all over trampled by their pastors, drinking petrol, and many others, sexual abuse and all of that. So people are aware and they are able to make decisions to belong to a religious institution with an informed decision, understanding. So that, for us, it has been a plus.
Wonderful.
Even including the language itself. We released a report on language. We had a dipstick in terms of how departments are using languages to reach communities. And that dipstick has helped us to see that these departments have got language committees, language facilities. How do they reach communities, including translations, brochures, pamphlets, so that communities are informed using their own local languages? I think that, for us, I think has been very, very useful.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
So let's continue with information sharing and the role of the public broadcaster, but broadcasting in general, and films, you name it. I just wonder, with the GBV, children's rights, those kinds of questions, has the public broadcaster done enough? How much more can be done? What kind of communication do you think can help with the rights that women should be enjoying, being free of violence, victimization, inequality?
Thanks, Peter. I think we need to do more. And I'm thinking this kind of conversations, we should have regular of this kind of conversations, not only wait to pick up momentum during Women's Month or Human Rights Month. So regular engagement, I think it would help to raise awareness, particularly using the local languages. And again, outreach programs to communities. We need to see more of the public broadcaster engaging with communities, just so that you get to hear from themselves how they see these issues, what could be the solutions, because I think it's important to have community-driven solutions to the challenges that they encounter in those communities regarding access to basic services that impact on their rights. So I think it would be really, really helpful to have more outreach programs, but also how do we engage young people, those in schools and those out of school? We have a high number of unemployed youth. How do we keep them informed of their rights? I know their greatest concern should be putting food on the table, but making them informed citizens that would eventually respect other people's rights, continuously raising awareness on issues around prevention of gender-based violence, some of the cultural practices that perpetuates gender-based violence. Yes, culture is important, but it needs to change somehow. For instance, ukutwala, we cannot continue to have that process in the name of saying we are preserving our culture. We need to raise those kind of conversations and engage traditional leaders. They are very, very important as custodians of our cultures and practices. So how do we engage them in the conversations? Because communities listen to the traditional leaders and make sure that it's an inclusive process. We get communities to voice their challenges regarding this, their rights and how they see the issues being addressed. And particularly the economic empowerment. We really need to be intentional on programs to empower communities, because if people are empowered, they can make informed decisions, that's one, and some of them who are victims, they can actually leave those abusive relationships. Thank you.
Yep.
Respond. There's an issue here about ukutwala. We have investigated ukutwala, and what we have found as a commission is that the ukutwala traditional practice served a particular purpose during that time. Now, with the ascendancy of modernity, people have distorted it, and they've used Ukuthwala as a form of abduction. Abducting young women, marry them, or even selling young girls to older men. And we are saying, do not blame the concept, blame the practice. Because if a concept has been distorted of its primary use, which was an introduction to young women and young men who wanted to get married, who were unlocking conversation between the two families, cannot be the same with somebody who abducted a young woman. So we need to make sure that is the case. We as a commission have identified harmful practices, and Ukuthwala is not among those. So it is important to educate our people about these cultural practices, because you can use a Eurocentric determination of a culture because of the way in which it is used, but look to how it was used and the purpose for which it served. Number two, Jezile was arrested for abducting a young woman under the pretext of Ukuthwala. We went to Equality Court. We were the friends of the court. He was sentenced to 20 years imprisonment precisely because the court found that he violated the cultural practice. It was not the intention of Ukuthwala which he practiced. Thank you so much.
Okay, so access to the law means also knowledge of the law. Is there something else that we can do more of? Because I know there are some legal provisions that say you must report a certain thing within a period of time. If you don't know that, that's the end of it. And I just wonder what we can do to make sure that people don't find themselves in a situation where they only become aware when it's too late. Section blah, blah, blah says you should report this by, or that your debt expires after 2 years, whatever it is, that person no longer owes you any money. How do we fix this?
The normal prescription period for a matter, for a complaint or a claim is 3 years. But there are exceptions. If maybe you heard about a rape or a sexual assault that happened years back, that we can even claim right now, that happens 10, 20 years ago, then in terms of the general rule, 3 years is prescribed, but we can even bring a case even now. I agree with my sister that awareness is a big issue. Awareness really has to be the forefront, either as a Chapter 9 institution or as a NGO or as a government. I think awareness, partnership, collaboration with all stakeholders involved is really the big issue. Then the department has what we called justice on the airwaves. We partner with the community radio stations where we raise awareness on all justice services. Community radio stations use different languages, and that in that way, usage of particular language that members of the community are conversant with, then that is the way to go. I fully agree that awareness is the way to go. And awareness in terms of informing and in terms of really making people aware of old or new services, or being people aware of legislation that really impact on their rights. The test of a document that Prof mentioned earlier on, it was really proven in the Khoisan legislation. The Khoisan legislation that was really implemented, or let's say passed, but it was later on reversed because there was no consultation. What is a consultation? Consultation is a big word. So many legislation has really been reversed by the court because there was no proper consultation, there was no proper public participation. Then even if it's nicely drafted, complies with the law, but if there is no consultation with the impacted community or impacted stakeholders, then it's going to be reversed, because that is the provisions that is there in the Constitution, that you can't pass a legislation that really impact greatly to a particular community or to a particular sector of the society, then you can't really, then you have consulted. because their views are very important.
All right, so question for all three of you. And this is a big one, because some of the issues that we're going to discuss now, we're not always 100% certain whether it's a right or not a right. So when we look at poverty, how do we address that? Is it a right not to be poor? Is it a right for us to demand from our state to make sure that we're not mired in poverty and die in poverty? Social grants, for example, are those rights, or is this a nice to have? I want your thoughts, all three of you. Let me start with you, Grafney.
I think it's a right not to be poor, because it's a human right. Then being poor, that means you are affecting my rights. And I'm leaving the country, then I put you there just to protect me and to not to allow me really to be poor, to go to sleep without having food. And it's a discussion by each and every government departments, either basic education in terms of access to education, Department of Social Development in terms of really providing social grants for the children under particular age or for the elderly. And then I think it's a right that has to be protected. But the issue is how much social grant will be enough not to be poor. There's been some complaints about the 350 rand that is given to post-COVID. That has been said, then it's not enough. There is also legislation passed, the minimum standards that has been put in place by government to say each and if you are a worker, that there should be a particular amount that is afforded to a worker. They say it's not enough. The federations, especially the labor unions, they say it's not enough. But it is a right not to be poor, and it's a right really not to go to sleep without food.
All right, Detlande, then we'll come to you now, Prof.
So this is very interesting when we talk about rights, because rights go with responsibilities. If I say I have a right to education, it is my responsibility to learn. And I think that is where many people get it wrong, that they can always demand their rights, but not being responsible to protect those rights. So it's important that as we engage on awareness on human rights, also make people aware that they have a responsibility rather than a sense of entitlement, which at times is what we see. Now, poverty is an issue that has to be addressed. And it's a broad term because it speaks to unemployment, it speaks to inequality and a number of other issues. So we have a right not to live in poverty. And it is the key responsibility of a government to ensure that citizens' rights are upheld using the resources available. So that is the responsibility of government, to use the state resources to fight corruption and crime so that there's money that would be invested on education, so that there's money for proper health and creating jobs. So now, talking about the child grants or any sort kind of grant, that is also a controversial topic, especially now going towards the elections, because one question is, for how long will government sustain this? You and I know that the people who are paying tax that fits into social grants, it's a limited number. We are getting taxed so much, but for how long? Is this sustainable? I don't see it being sustainable. Government needs to be intentional with other economic empowerment opportunities so that we don't have this high population of our people relying on social grants. And some of them could actually do with proper jobs. Yes, there are people who are, for instance, who are disabled living with disabilities, that we know they'll need this for longer. But
Right.
some, there could be other options.
Prof, your thoughts?
Touched on a very important area, the issue of obligation, responsibility. There is no right without limits. All rights have limitations. If you look at section 36 of the Constitution, it tells you rights are not absolute. So no one can claim each and everything to be my right. When it comes to issues of poverty, question is, what are the causes of poverty? Is it deliberate? Because if people can fend for themselves, they can do so because it's part of their responsibility, which is enshrined in the Constitution, to work. But if there's no employment, who should create employment? Some say government should create employment. Government does not have factories. Government create conditions for business to thrive, for business to be started. Now, you have to look at the training of your people. Do you have institutions that train young men so that they should not become what we call statistics of unemployed? When they qualify, they themselves become the creators of jobs for themselves and others. So this is a problematic issue. If you talk about rights, a right to life is for everybody. But the right to work is what we must, as individuals, make sure that we look for it. So otherwise you are creating a welfare state, and welfare state is not sustainable at all. So that's how I look at it. Let's make sure institutions create young men and young women who are skilled sufficiently to create factories for themselves and hire others, which is now absent in the way in which we educate. We educate paper people. When they qualify, they've got a certificate, and the certificate can't give you employment all the time. Skillful individuals is what this country needs. Thank you.
Okay, when we started this conversation, I talked about the modern setting. 2024, a lot has happened since 1994. 1994, we didn't have wide use of the internet. We didn't have as much digitization as we have now. In fact, everything was pretty much analog at that time. So in 2024, for me to interact with the Department of SARS, for example, I have to book an appointment online. Does this mean that things like data should be a human right in the modern time? Let me start with you, Prof.
What is a right? I think let's start there. What is a right? If I say I have a right, it simply means I have a right to do something. It simply means that in doing it, I won't do it badly or unlawfully. In doing it, what I want to do, I won't do it badly or unlawfully. Now it creates two things there. Bad, it's both moral and ethical. And lawful, it's legal. Okay? So if any action you take, first assess, where does it fall? Now, when you talk about access to digital data, digital data is what you purchase. What the government should do is the cost thereof. How to make it affordable. It should not be astronomical, so that everybody can use it for purposes of that. You have to use it because it's important to enable you to do what you have to do as an individual or as a community. The role of government is in the regulation of the provision of that, what do you call, the service. Thank you.
Data, and I'm using data as something that's modern, and the human rights story evolves over time as we live in different circumstances. It is almost impossible now to survive this world without being connected at some point or the other. And I've used SARS as an example because I wanted to go in to see someone, and they said to me, you must book online for an appointment. And if I don't have data, what does that mean? So whilst I've mentioned data, I'm really talking about modern rights that we should be throwing into the hat of human rights that perhaps weren't so in 1994. So your thoughts on data or anything else that we should be putting into the hat in 1994?
Yes, just to reiterate the cost implication, as Prof mentioned it. I'm thinking, as we all know, basic rights have to be free or reasonably affordable to all people. So looking at data and the cost, government really has to do a lot to help ensure that data is reasonably cheap for everybody to access. In cities such as here in Gauteng, there are places where you can access free Wi-Fi, but that is not the case across the country. What about rural communities? How do they then have this Wi-Fi or data to then access the services or book appointments? So it is important as we are moving with the modern times, but government has to bear the cost to ensure that all this data is affordable. There is also a threat to this, and this is a challenge that I don't know how, as a country, we'll manage this. Data availability, especially for young people, it exposes them to a whole lot of issues that impact on their psychological well-being. They get access to some of the websites that really expose them to issues that one can't even begin to explain. And then parents see children behaving in a very strange manner because they are exposed to all sorts of online circumstances, including human trafficking. So there's a challenge there in terms of how much of this data serves to promote human rights and how much is a threat and a risk, particularly to women and girls who become now victims of human trafficking, among other issues.
Okay, so Grafni, I know that the law should be a living thing that evolves, case law and all sorts of things. The Constitutional Court judges will write things. Is it moving quickly enough to embrace modern living in terms of things that should be rights? Do you think that we are considering things at a pace so that things that we should be taking for granted are in our constitution or in our law to force our authorities to give us the minimum that we need to survive as human beings?
The law and the judgments that are really coming out, I don't remember any case that has been tested in terms of access to technology or access to data, or whether it should be freely available. I know the Department of Communications, they have done some. I think there was a step from the Department of Communication in terms of requesting the service providers, like all the networks like Vodacom, MTN, to slash the cost for the data, and also the because government like my department that I'm working for they are now in the process of making the master services, like the access to estate, access to Guardian Fund, and an application thereof to be digital. But the intention is not only just to be digital to each and everyone. The intention is for those who have an access to data to use those services digitally. But people at the rural areas, like the good doctor has just said, it's difficult for them to access that particular information. And then I'm thinking of the law that really regulate the access that can be tested by us to say, if I don't have an access to data, or I'm not given enough access to data, can that be a infringement of a particular right? And access to like the municipalities that are really providing Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi services in particular areas, but it's not throughout the country. And for individual to challenge the Constitution or to approach a court to say, if I'm not provided, then I can take a particular department to court to say, why are you providing these digital services, but you are not providing data to access them? And that will be a challenge for the country to see. And I'm not any privy to any case so far in the country that really have tested that particular right to say it should be provided. But like human rights, it really applies to each and every service, each and every issue that really troubles the community. Then it's not like data, even if it's not specifically enshrined in the Constitution, but you can use the socio-economic rights that are in the Constitution really to say, government, then why don't you, because you are giving me these particular services digitally, then why don't you provide me data to access those rights?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big one to unpack. And as I said, I'm perhaps being naughty in picking data because it's a tricky one. But it does speak about modernity in the world that we're living in. When does something that used to be a luxury become a necessity? There was a time when email started. You know, some people say, I'm never going to get it. Now, if you don't have email, you're going to get left behind completely. We're going to take a break, and then we're going to start to explore some questions. We have a few people here who wear different hats as well. Get their thoughts on their areas of expertise and thought. And we'll also look at the comments that you've been making on the stream, and we'll pick up on that as well. So we're going to take a 5-minute break, stretch your legs, and we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. All right, welcome back. We are continuing with our conversation, looking at the issue of human rights. It's Human Rights Month in South Africa, and we're coming to the last days of it. But it is something that we've been observing 30 years into democracy, and we're reminded of where we've come from, the challenges that we faced in dismantling apartheid, and embracing a constitution in 1996. And we got all excited about these rights that we could enjoy. And we've found that perhaps it hasn't been as rosy as it should have been. There are challenges, and we celebrate the successes. We celebrate the things that have gone well. But we also need to be mindful of the things that we still need to overcome, particularly when it comes to human rights and access to these rights. I have a panel that's been helping us unpack the issue of human rights, but we also have with us in the audience a few people that want to share their thoughts about human rights generally, and one of them is Makosa Zanahorst, who's with the Film and Publications Board. If I could just ask you to share your thoughts about the conversation that we've had, and also what human rights means, particularly when you wear that Film and Publications Board hat.
Thank you so much, Program Director. You know, for me and to our panelists, you've done a great job in terms of unpacking. But for me, we can't deny the fact that progress has been made towards the realization of this right. We cannot deny that. However, more still needs to be done, because we're sitting here talking about the issues of awareness, and 30 years has lapsed. So it's a problem, but also an indictment to all of us who are working in the public sector. So for me, when I look at the issue of the socio-economic rights, especially the rights of access to social security, we have a lot of programs that we have in the country that are aimed towards restoring dignity. You know, last week I was talking to one of my aunt, and she was so excited that now she's getting a old age grant. She's been unemployed for the rest of her life, being a housewife, but that a grant is giving her dignity. So for me, that is critical and important. But one of the issues that has been raised here, it's the issue of technology. So technology has changed the way people are accessing information, the way they are consuming information. And for me, if we're saying in 30 years there is no awareness of the basic rights where we're just interacting amongst each other without the internet, and the impact, especially when we look at the right of freedom of expression. And everyone has that right. I have a right to say anything that I like about you. But in the brick and mortar or amongst us as a community, the impact is limited to those who were there in some instances when I was saying, maybe you are gay or you are cheating on your husband. But if I post that in social media, the impact, it's global. It's no longer limited to just a village. And for me, the critical issues, us as the Film and Publication Board, our role is to protect children. We classify content. Previously, we've been seen as a censorship board. We're no longer a censorship board, but we are there to protect children and balance the right to freedom of expression. And last year, 2022 March, we have a new responsibility. We are an online safety regulator, and we are responsible for regulating the online content. So that is part of the progress that has been made in ensuring human rights. But the problem now, Prof, we know of the saying that it takes a village to raise a child. But what do we do now? The village is global. And what is the role of your commission? What is our role as government employees, as regulators, in making sure that the village is empowered because of technology? Kids, most of the kids are staying with their grandparents. So can they really raise the children in making sure that they have a safe digital environment? So those are the issues that we need to take into consideration. And that is part of our role also. As the Film and Publication Board, we have a lot of education where we educate teachers on online safety and parents. But these are the challenges that whilst we have 30 years now, but there are more challenges other than at the time when the Constitution came into effect. And of course, the question of whether do we really need to review the Constitution. I also want to comment on the issue of access to speedy resolution. Yes, people have a right of access to courts, but also a right of having their dispute being resolved in an appropriate forum. So when you look at the Films and Publications Act, one of the critical issues that we have, the issue of gender-based violence, it has moved online. And one of the cases that we're dealing with will be around the issues of revenge porn. Intimate images, photographs, films are distributed in various social media. And this affects mostly women. And it talks to the issue of gender-based violence, which has now moved online. But the challenge again, we have what we call an enforcement committee in terms of the Films and Publication Board. It's a quasi-judicial body that is chaired by a retired judge. And our current chair is Judge Masipa. So any person whose intimate images have been shared without your consent, you have a right to lodge a complaint with the Films and Publications Board. And it's for free. There's no queue, and you are treated with dignity. But the challenge that we normally have, people might have the right, but they opt not to exercise their rights. So that is the critical challenge that we have. And for me, Prof, I will point to you again because it talks to what is acceptable in communities. Because communities, I agree with you, I have an individual right, but also as communities, what is it that is acceptable amongst us? Because the issues of violence against women, children, it starts at what is acceptable within the community. Is it acceptable that my right is violated and I should keep quiet and not open a case? So for me, the role of communities are critical in that regard. And yeah, the simplification of the law, it's a problem. Because then it means as a consumer, I am reading the legislation, but I don't understand, even if I'm willing to exercise my rights. So we have that responsibility of also using the simplified language, but also as regulators, we also creating instruments that are simplifying the legislation. That is the responsibility that we have. Then another issue that I want to raise, it's around, again, is the freedom of expression. With social media, you know, we have to be cautious. People are taking pictures of their kids, pictures of themselves being naked, posting them freely, sharing with friends. But again, you are sharing with the entire world. So it's critical to know the settings also on your social media platforms because you have to protect yourself. In some instances, yes, the right to privacy, it's being violated. And one of the issues that we are doing as the Film and Publication Board, it's around just educating members of the public, peer-to-peer video sharing. We see people attending private events. Gogo is dancing, she is excited with a glass of wine. Their dancing is a close family gathering. But somebody is taking videos, and then it becomes a world function, and you are invading people's privacy. So those are the critical issues, and it talks to awareness. Yes, you have a right to express yourself, you have a right to share. However, you don't have a right to infringe on privacy and dignity of others. So we do have what we call a peer-to-peer video sharing guideline. In that guideline, we are just giving the basic requirements of what is it that is allowed of you to conduct yourself in social media. So that becomes critical. You know, another last issue that I want to focus on is around the access of children to gadgets. We are protecting children. We work very closely with the police. And one of the cases we are responsible for is around child pornography. We've seen a lot of cases. Online grooming is a real issue. We work with the global networks, and most of the cases it's shocking that you have kids as young as 8 months who are masturbating, and they are being groomed, and they are addicted. Started as young as 8 months to masturbate. Because you have these adults who are now in the online space behaving to be kids, because you don't know what is it that your child is doing. The child might be honestly looking at cartoons, but then there will be a link to press, and they use the webcams to give them instructions, to take intimate videos, intimate pictures, and send them to these individuals. So the internet, it's not really a safe space. It has its good and the bad, and now again, it talks to parenting, responsible parenting, because we use the gadgets to make sure that our kids don't bother us, but it is very, very risky. So these are the issues that I want to raise, that we have to make sure that as parents, we parent also responsibly, because the internet is not the right place for children. Then the harm on social media, TikTok, Facebook, we can't deny again the fact that it's there to entertain, to inform. If I want to know how to cook any other kind of a dish, I can just go to TikTok and I will get that. It's there to entertain. But however, there are also harmful content there. So those are the critical things that are affecting the human rights. Lastly, the second speaker spoke about the issues of misinformation and disinformation. That's another challenge that is there, and especially affecting women. One of the work that we are doing around that is educating women, but we are also monitoring the social media space to just determine what is the extent of abuse of women, especially now during election, women politicians. And we are providing training in that regard. But for me, is progress have indeed been made. And to the colleague at the Department of Justice, even including you, Prof, there is a need for us to work together, because I am realizing that we're working in silos. As we do a classification of films and movies, we create a classification guideline, Prof, which take into consideration the values of the communities. What is it that is now acceptable? Because that is how we provide guidance in terms of age rating. Every 5 years, we have a responsibility to review our classification guideline to make sure that we improve and get knowledge from individuals in the Republic to check what is it that is acceptable for us to say the age rating is 13 or is acceptable for all the families. But more work still needs to be done. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very, very much indeed for sharing those thoughts, very comprehensive, and also giving us a perspective from the Film and Publications Board. Thank you so much, Makosazana Lindhorst. Let me call on Reverend Mvambo from the Moral Regeneration Movement to share your thoughts as well.
Yep. Just two things that I wanted to raise. And one of them, it relates to the comment that Prof made about the commercialization of religion. I know that you did a study on that, but I don't think many people are aware of that kind of a study. What is it that we are doing as a commission to make sure that people know about the outcomes of that study, of that investigation? Because if you look at that period during the COVID era, because churches were no longer very open and active, there was a reduction of this kind of practices. Even now, if you look at the statistics, there are new forms of certain practices that are unacceptable to communities. What I wanted to check, how far are you in terms of ensuring that people know their rights on what is acceptable and what is not acceptable? We know that religion is freedom of choice. But to what degree do people actually have to make those choices, because sometimes it's not people who are making choices. Somebody else is making choices on their behalf. Number two, I wanted to check with the issue of the courts. I know that you raised an issue about accessibility of the courts and so on. But our worry is, how far-reaching is the department ensuring that people, in particular in the rural areas, have access to information and these courts? Because many a times you'll find that these courts are concentrated in the urban settings. They are not reachable, particularly for the rural communities. And the issue of, again, education. Yes, we say we have got free education, but have South Africans checked what is it that we really, the content of this education that we're talking about? How does it impact on our communities? Is there a link, for example, between our education system and the economy? Because that's part of the problem. You've got an education system that is not linked to the economy, and as you put it, Prof, correctly, you've got people who've got paper. But what do you do with that paper? After graduating, you remain a graduate. We've got so many unemployed graduates today because there is a problem between our education system and our economy. Those are just few points I wanted to raise. But also the question of ethical leadership. South Africa is suffering from a crisis. Everybody right now, we are going for elections. We've got more political parties than any other country in the world. And what is interesting is, do our people actually check what kind of leadership are they going to elect? These are some just of the concerns that we need to try and do more of education in terms of educating our public. Thank you.
Very much indeed, Reverend. And I think what De Clare said earlier on is that some of these rights come with responsibility. And voting is certainly one of them. And so we really need to be careful and to think through where we put our X's when it comes to voting time. My last speaker from the floor, and I want to ask Dean Webb to share some thoughts, particularly when it comes to human rights and when it comes to people with disabilities. Dean, your thoughts?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, just regarding public services, public transport, there seems to be a gap when people with disabilities are trying to get their way to and from work. It's just one of the gaps I'm finding in with regards to people with disabilities.
Dean, if I could just ask a couple of questions.
Yes.
I mean, I've traveled, luckily, many parts of the world, and I'm finding that there are a lot of enabling things that other countries are doing. Do you think that our authorities are aware of them, or is it just a question of they're not getting there quick enough? They know that they should be having sound in certain types of vehicles, cars, public transport, etc., etc. What do you think is holding back people with disabilities in terms of accessing the rights to be able to use public transport, as you've said?
I think more than anything, it's the availability. And when, having experienced this myself in the past, is when you're on public transport, you've got to keep asking people around you, where are you? Because you don't get that notification. I am aware that in certain countries that there are there's a speaker system on the buses or trains, whatever it is, to allow so you know where you are, so that you don't get off at the wrong spot.
Right, right. Dean, thanks very, very much indeed. I wish we could have talked for much longer on a lot of these issues, but again, this human rights question is a large one, and one that we probably need to have more often, more than just during Human Rights Month, more than just on Human Rights Day, as was stated earlier. To my panelists, we're starting to wrap up now. We don't have a lot of time, unfortunately, so I'm going to ask you to answer some of the questions maybe that have been asked, but in less than 2 minutes. If you could just sum up your thoughts in terms of human rights 30 years on and what should be following. Let me start with you, Tyler, because you were last first.
Okay, no, thanks, and thanks to our fellow audience speakers who made some very valuable inputs. And I just want to agree with Makosazana, yes, there is progress. Hence why I mentioned earlier to say access to education, but now the challenge could be the quality. And these are the conversations that we really need to continue to have. And I think we need to engage further outside of this space, because in the line of work that I do, I think we'll need to get people to understand and know about the role of the board that you operate on, and addressing the challenges of graduates, unemployed graduates. I think we need to revisit as a country some fund for these young graduates so that they can be able to start the business. They may have the interest, but the startup capital is missing. And that's something that I think government need to relook. And on the rights of persons with disabilities, this is one of the topics very close to my heart. I think there's just no political will and commitment on the side of government. I mean, they know, they travel the world, they see these things, and they just need to be intentional as well. Political will on the side of government to ensure the respect of the rights of persons with disability. And lastly, I just want to say 30 years South Africa has missed an opportunity to have a woman as a candidate for any of the key political parties. And this is really, really heartbreaking for those of us looking back from 1956, how strong the women's movement has been in the country. We have very weak women caucuses in parliament across all political parties who are very loyal to their political parties than the cause and issues that affect women in the country. And it would have been better if at least political parties would have put women as a running mate. But alas, we're really not doing well in that regard. But thanks so much.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Grafni, your final thoughts?
Thank you. Responding to some of the comments and the questions, I agree with my sister from the publication board that we should work together. Working in silos really doesn't help, because like I was saying earlier, that awareness really is a big issue. Then we have to work together to ensure that communities are aware of the services of government as a whole. And access to courts, really, it's the department has done a lot in terms of really expanding the jurisdiction of the court. If you can see some of the courts that are in the rural areas, they've been expanded to include all services. Then even now, like the Masters F services that normally are at the urban areas, they have now been moved to courts that are at the rural areas. The legal aid has always been tasked. As we can see, each and every village there's a legal aid office. They've been really tasked to ensure that they're assisting members of the community in terms of the estate issues, in terms of the guardian fund issues. Education, quality of the education really is an issue, but the quality thereof can be tested as when you work. Then hence the government is trying by all means to encouraging the business sector to ensure that when you do a learnership or internship, there is no need for an experience. And then in that way, then you'll be able to expand experience by doing the internship and the learnership. Because I think most of the denial by the private sector is because when you are required to work, you are required an experience. And then if really some of the employment agencies, then they are really trying that they are avoiding that element of really being being where you are required to have an experience before you can get an employment. I'm stressing again the importance of the equality courts. We have been challenged in the past about accessibility of equality courts by persons with disabilities. We have been challenged so many times, hence now the department has really developed a program on the ramps and the lifts so that people can be able to access courts without really using the stairs. And I think the program, the project has really gone, it is in an advanced stage now where all courts should have ramps or should have the lifts so that the courts can be accessed and other justice services can be accessed. With regard to transport, that is not my area of responsibility, but I think we can challenge those institutions that are providing transport to ensure that they have those voice-enabled facilities for the person with disability can be able to know where they get off at a particular destination. Then that challenge, the system is there to be used. Then we can challenge, hence I would say we are challenged in terms of access of courts by persons with disability. The Department of Transport and also institutions that are providing transport services, they can be challenged by using the equality courts to ensure that transport services have those facilities for the disabled person. I think going forward in terms of from the 30 years of democracy going forward for the next 8 years or so, working together, I think, hence we have a conference last week of really taking stock of the human rights in the country that have been there the last 8 years. I think if we work together to ensure hold government accountable and then request government to provide services where they are needed, I think we can really go a long way.
Thank you so much indeed, Grafni. And the final word from you, Prof. Musoma.
First, thank you so much. The issue of what we have been able to achieve for the last 30 years, I think it's underscored by a number of people. There has been indeed progress. We have shown a number of areas of improvements in the lives of the people, provision of housing and so forth and so forth. But I wanted to also indicate that the issue of rights, no one right is more important than the other. It would appear that when we emphasize the human rights at the expense of less emphasis on the community rights, we do not have a balancing act. It would appear even the broadcasters focuses only on the individual rights, the human rights. But yet the Constitution says they exist in Section 185 of the Constitution, the cultural rights. Why don't we put them together and say 30 years of both human and cultural rights as a balancing theme for South Africa? And I think we need to be sensitive and to be aware that these are the rights that are embodied in our Constitution. So they need to be exercised and lived by all South Africans. Second is the issue of the community becoming the world, global community. I take it from the Chinese. The Chinese have an expression when they look at their own environment. They said, everything with a Chinese characteristic. In other words, you can come with anything, but it has to have what we call Chinese characteristic. I don't think we in South Africa are so proud to say whatever gets done, it must have a South African characteristic. Whether we raise children, whether we build communities, it must have a South African characteristic. So the issue of the village becoming global starts with the particularity. And the particularity is the what? Family unity. Are we developing those families? Before they become global, you must develop those families. So the emphasis in developing family units are critical for survival of our families and our children as well. That is a key. with regard to commercialization of religion, what are we doing? And the fact that we're talking about it today, here, it's an indication of its importance. This particular broadcasting has assisted us. We have had a number of investigative hearings where we brought in people and the radios and everybody else were listening into. Now, we have even court cases that are taking place. Omotoso in the Eastern Cape, you know that case? It's a consequence of that. And one also in Johannesburg. And then just a day before yesterday, one pastor was sentenced to 20 years for abusing children in Ekurhuleni. What is that? It's because people are aware. They can now go and report abuses in the religious institutions. So that awareness is really at the heart of everybody. Now, when you make decision to become a religious person or a Christian or any other religion, first think, is this the right place to be? What does it offer? Is it this helping me to grow both mentally, spiritually, and otherwise? Is this an abusive, or is this just a fake religious institution, which is the case? And we have a unit in the commission, public education unit, which is responsible for ensuring that all communities are visited, and we have seminars, we have conferences to educate people about that. So, but our view is that it may have now mutated, the abuse may have been mutated, taking different forms. But the previous forms are now, people are aware, they can actually identify them. If they choose to go, it's because of their own volition. So we are really doing that. But the last thing I want to mention is that as we protect and promote culture, we have realized that the emphasis in the country is more aesthetic. It's about ideas, it's about song, it's about dance, it's about all a number of things. They are good. They are very good things that we need to do, which is non-material things. But whether the time has not come to develop the material aspect of culture, what is that? Because culture is not about dance. It's about creating tools, manufacturing, and things like that. Are you aware that when you drive a Mercedes-Benz, you are driving a German culture? That Mercedes, it represents German culture. When you have a Samsung or you have Apple, you are using somebody's culture. Until we distill culture into the material things that represent what we produce innovatively, we have missed the aspect of culture. For example, on the 24th of September, instead of us converging in our nice clothes and things like that and talking about our legacy, why don't we use that day for South Africans to bring their own innovation and display them and say, this is what this year we've been able to achieve in terms of manufacturing, in terms of innovation, whatever the case may be. This we have created, and that must be a symbol of using that culture now, making it a material culture rather than non-material culture. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, a big hand for Professor David Lukam Msoma, Chairperson of the Cultural, Religious and Linguistic Rights Commission. Dr. Ditalale Rabele, who's the Gender Program Manager, Foundation for Human Rights. And Grafni Seleka, who's State Law Advisor at the Department of Justice and Constitutional Development. Thank you so much indeed for your contribution and your thoughts. My guests in the audience as well, the speakers that shared so eloquently, thank you very much indeed for your participation. And for you that's been watching at home, thank you so, so much indeed for joining us for this conversation. Human rights, let us not take them for granted. They came at a price, a heavy price for some that never got to enjoy them so that we could. The elections are coming soon. One of the rights that you have is to vote. And as we heard earlier today, your rights come with responsibilities. So exercise those responsibilities and also defend them as they were defended and fought for in days past. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us as we think about and commemorate and celebrate human rights. Until the next time, goodbye.